Tonight's story comes from a message sent by one of our listeners. He didn't want their name mentioned. He said this wasn't something they'd ever told anyone in full before. Not friends, not family. He just said they'd been carrying it for years, and it felt worse to keep it quiet than to finally let it out. Here's what he wrote. I moved into the building in late October when the air started smelling like wet leaves and cold concrete. It was an old 3-story walk-up with narrow hallways and a front door that never shut all the way unless you pulled it hard. The rent was low. The neighborhood was quiet. The unit had just enough space for a couch, a small kitchen table, and a bedroom that looked out onto an alley full of dumpsters and stray cats. I remember feeling relieved more than anything. I'd been staying with a friend after a breakup, living out of boxes and pretending it didn't bother me. This place felt like starting over in a controlled way. It was plain, clean, anonymous. The kind of building where nobody asked questions because everyone had their own reasons for keeping to themselves. On the first night, I unpacked in silence. I didn't put anything on the walls. I ate standing up at the counter, listening to the muffled sounds of other people living nearby. Pipes knocking, a television through the floor, someone's footsteps in the hall. It wasn't comforting exactly, but it made me feel less alone. I fell asleep thinking I'd made a practical choice. The next morning, I met my neighbor for the first time. I was carrying a trash bag down the stairs when the door across from mine opened. A man stepped out into the hallway like he'd been waiting for the right moment. He was thin, clean-shaven, wearing a plain gray hoodie and jeans. Nothing about him stood out, except how quiet he moved, like he was careful not to take up space. He nodded once and smiled, small and contained. He said hello in a voice that didn't push. I said hello back. He introduced himself as Mark. I told him my name. The exchange was brief and normal, the kind of neighbor interaction you forget 5 minutes later. He held the stairwell door for me and went back inside without lingering. For the first few weeks, that was how it stayed. I heard him occasionally through the wall. Soft movement, a cabinet closing, water running. I never heard music. I never heard laughter. Sometimes I'd pass his door in the hallway and catch a faint smell of laundry soap, as if he'd just cleaned something. I filed him away as quiet, maybe introverted, maybe someone who worked odd hours. In a building like that, quiet felt like a courtesy. I settled into my own routine quickly. I left for work around 8:15 every morning, coffee in one hand, keys in the other. I came home around 6:30, stopped at the mailbox, climbed the stairs, unlocked my door. I cooked simple meals, watched shows I didn't really care about, went to bed by 11. I liked knowing what the next day would look like. Routine felt like stability, and stability felt like safety. Mark's routine seemed even simpler. I saw him in the hallway maybe once every few days, always at the edges of my schedule. Sometimes he'd be coming down the stairs as I was going up. He'd pause slightly to let me pass. Sometimes he'd be standing by the mailbox when I walked in, holding a small stack of envelopes. He never lingered. He never tried to talk beyond a polite greeting. The building could have swallowed him entirely, and I wouldn't have questioned it. The first time something felt wrong, it was almost too minor to acknowledge. I came home one evening and noticed my doormat was turned slightly, like someone had nudged it with their foot. It wasn't flipped over, it wasn't moved far, just rotated a few inches off center. I stood there with my key in the lock, staring at it. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd kicked it on my way out that morning. Maybe someone had brushed past it in the hallway. I nudged it back into place and went inside. 2 nights later, the same thing happened. The doormat was angled again, but this time it was pushed closer to my door, almost tucked under it. I squatted and pulled it back, feeling faintly ridiculous for caring. The hallway was empty, quiet. It smelled like old carpet. I went inside and didn't mention it to anyone. The next week, I started noticing small noises at night. Not the usual building sounds, not pipes, not footsteps, not distant TVS. Something softer, a faint scrape against the wall between our units. A tap, then a pause, then another tap. It always happened after I turned my bedroom light off. The first night I ignored it. The second night I listened more closely. The third night I checked the time without meaning to. 12:17 a.m. I remember because it was so specific. I lay there staring into the dark, counting the seconds between taps. Then it stopped. I fell asleep with my body still tense, like I'd been waiting for something that never arrived. The next night, it happened again. 12:17 a.m. Same rhythm, same faint scrape, same taps, spaced out like someone following a pattern they'd practiced. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Mark had a timer. Maybe he worked out at night. Maybe he was doing some kind of repetitive task. Maybe my brain was assigning meaning to it, because I was alone and newly unsettled and living in a new place. But once you notice a pattern, it changes how you hear everything else. After that, I started waking up before it happened. I'd glance at the clock, see 12:10, lie there waiting. My breathing would become shallow, my jaw would clench. And then, right on schedule, the tapping would begin. Like an alarm I couldn't turn off. I began sleeping with my bedroom door slightly open, as if having a view of the hallway inside my apartment would make me safer. It didn't. It just gave the darkness somewhere else to spread. During the day, Mark remained the same, quiet, polite, almost invisible. That was what made it hard to talk about. If he'd been loud, or rude, or obviously strange, it would have been easier to label him as a problem. Instead, he was the kind of neighbor you'd describe as nice, and nice people weren't supposed to make you feel watched. Then he started knowing things he shouldn't. It began with small comments in passing. One morning, as I was locking my door, Mark opened his at the same time. He nodded at my travel mug and said, "Hazelnut, right?" I froze, with my hand on the knob. I had been drinking hazelnut coffee since I moved in, but I didn't remember ever mentioning it. I didn't even remember carrying the same mug every day. Still, I smiled awkwardly and said something non-committal, like maybe. He smiled back, calm, and walked down the stairs. I told myself he'd smelled it. Coffee scent carries. It was a reasonable explanation, even if it didn't fully sit right. A few days later, I came home with a plastic bag from a pharmacy. I'd picked up allergy medication and a new toothbrush. I hadn't put the toothbrush in a separate bag. The cardboard packaging was visible through the thin plastic. As I stepped into the hallway, Mark's door opened. He looked at the bag and said, "The mint ones are better than the soft bristle ones." He said it like a casual recommendation, like we were having a normal neighbor conversation. My mouth went dry. I forced a laugh and said I'd keep that in mind. He nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. That night, the tapping started at 12:17, and for the first time, I wondered if it had something to do with me. A week after that, I noticed the hallway door at the front of the building was sometimes already unlocked when I came home. It was supposed to latch automatically. The landlord had mentioned it when I signed the lease, joking that you had to pull it hard. Most nights I did, but once or twice, I found it sitting slightly ajar, letting cold air creep into the stairwell. It bothered me enough that I mentioned it to the landlord in an email. He replied the next day, said he'd check it. A few days after that, the door seemed to close properly again. Then Mark said, "They fixed it." It happened on the stairs. I was coming up. He was going down. He paused beside me, close enough that I could smell clean laundry on his hoodie. "They fixed the door," he said softly, as if continuing a conversation we'd already been having. I hadn't told him about the email. I hadn't told anyone in the building. I stared at him for a second too long, then nodded and kept moving. He smiled slightly and continued down the stairs, his footsteps almost silent. That night, I checked my locks twice before bed. I started making small changes to my routine, without telling myself why. I left for work 5 minutes earlier. I took my trash out at different times. I avoided standing in the hallway too long. I stopped checking my mail every day because it meant lingering near the mailboxes, where Mark sometimes appeared. None of it mattered. He still managed to be there, at the edges of my day, like he was orbiting me, just outside the obvious. One evening I came home and found a package at my door. It was a small box, plain brown cardboard, no branding. My name was written correctly. The address was correct. There was no return label, just a printed shipping label and tape. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, stared at it for a long time. I hadn't ordered anything. I didn't know anyone who would send me a surprise package. I picked it up, felt its weight, listened for movement inside. Nothing rattled. It felt solid, carefully wrapped. I opened it slowly, with a pair of scissors. Inside was a new doormat. It was the same design as mine, same cheap pattern, same size. A near-perfect copy. It smelled faintly like plastic and fresh rubber, like it had been purchased recently. There was no note, no receipt, no explanation. I stood there holding it, like it might bite me. My first thought was that it had been delivered to the wrong unit, but my name was on the label, my unit number, my address. That made my stomach turn. Not dramatically, quietly, physically. I didn't use the mat. I put the box back together, shoved it into my closet, behind a stack of shoes, like hiding it would make it less real. The tapping continued at 12:17. Around that time, I noticed my bathroom mirror fogging up in ways that didn't make sense. I'd come home, use the bathroom, wash my hands, and see a faint rectangle of steam near the edge of the mirror, as if someone had taken a hot shower recently. But I hadn't run the shower. The air in my apartment wasn't humid enough for that. It happened twice in 1 week, both times late at night. I told myself it was a ventilation issue. Old buildings do weird things. Pipes carry heat. Mirrors fog for no reason. I held on to those explanations because the alternative was too specific to think about. Then one night, I heard my name. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't urgent. It sounded like someone saying it softly, almost conversationally, through the wall. I sat up in bed, fully awake in an instant. The room was dark. The only light came from the digital clock on my nightstand. 12:16 a.m., 1 minute before the tapping usually started. I held my breath and waited. A soft scrape came through the wall. Then very clearly, my name again. Said the way you say someone's name when you're trying to get their attention without waking anyone else up. The tapping began at 12:17, as if nothing had happened. The next day I told myself I'd imagined it. Stress does that. Lack of sleep does that. You start hearing patterns in noise. You start assigning meaning. I needed to believe it was my mind, not my neighbor, because believing it was him would mean I had to do something, and I didn't want to do something. That was the wrong decision. And it wasn't a single moment. It was a series of small choices. Each one felt reasonable on its own. Each one was easier than confronting the thought that I might be in danger. I didn't report the package. I didn't tell my landlord about the tapping. I didn't ask Mark directly what he was doing at night. I avoided him in the hallway and called it caution. I kept my voice polite, my face neutral, whenever we passed, because I didn't want to give him a reason to focus on me more. The night it became impossible to ignore. I came home and found my front door unlocked, not slightly open, not unlatched, fully closed, but the lock was not engaged. I stood there with my key in my hand, staring at the knob. I remembered locking it that morning. I remembered the click. I remembered tugging it once, like I always did. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the apartment looked normal, at first glance. Nothing ransacked, nothing obviously missing. The lights were off. The air smelled the way it always did, faintly like my laundry detergent, and the candle I'd burned the night before. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, engaging the deadbolt immediately. My hands were shaking, not dramatically, more like my body had realized something before my mind caught up. In the living room, my couch cushions had been rearranged, not thrown around, just shifted, squared off neatly, as if someone had sat there and then made sure everything looked presentable before leaving. On my coffee table, my TV remote had been placed perfectly, centered, aligned with the edge, like a display in a store. And on the corner of the table was a glass of water. It was half full. Condensation beaded on the outside, fresh enough that it hadn't dried. I didn't own a glass like that. My glasses were thicker, mismatched. This one was tall, narrow, clean. It looked like it had been taken from someone else's kitchen. I stood there staring at it until my eyes started to burn. I didn't call the police. I didn't call a friend. I told myself I couldn't prove anything. I told myself it would be humiliating to explain. I told myself the police would ask questions, and I would sound paranoid, and Mark would find out, and then things would get worse. Instead, I dumped the water in the sink, washed the glass with shaking hands, and put it in the back of a cabinet, like it belonged to me. That was the moment I chose silence. In a way I can't forgive. A few days later, there was a knock on my door in the middle of the afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw a woman I didn't recognize standing in the hallway. She held a folder and looked tired, like she'd been walking up and down stairs all day. I opened the door only part way, the chain still on. She introduced herself as a property manager from the building next door. She said she was looking for information about a tenant who used to live in my unit before I moved in, a woman named Erica. She asked if I'd received any mail for her or if anyone had mentioned her recently. I told her no, that I hadn't seen anything. The property manager nodded slowly, like she expected that. She glanced down the hallway toward Mark's door and then back at me. She didn't say anything else. She just thanked me and walked away. After she left, I stood behind my door for a long time, listening to her footsteps fade down the stairs. The hallway felt colder, too quiet. That night, I searched the name she'd given me online. Erica had been reported missing 2 months before I moved in. There were posts from friends asking for information, a blurred photo of her smiling in daylight, comments from strangers speculating, a mention of her last known location. Near her apartment, no updates, no closure. I stared at her face on my screen and felt something shift deep in my chest, slow, heavy. I thought about the doormat, the copied mat in my closet. I thought about the tapping at 12:17, the same time every night. I thought about the way Mark seemed to know things that weren't his to know. I thought about the glass of water on my table. That didn't belong to me. And I realized something that made me cold all over. He wasn't just watching me, he was repeating something. That was the quiet consequence. Not an event that exploded into action, but a realization settling into place, like a lock turning. A pattern that existed before me and would exist after me. A routine that didn't start when I moved in and wasn't created because of me, but had simply adjusted to include me. I moved out within a week. I didn't give a long explanation. I told the landlord there were issues with the unit. I paid the penalty. I packed my things in the middle of the day, every light on, every curtain open, my phone in my pocket, like a lifeline. On my last trip down the stairs, I passed Mark's door and heard the faint sound of movement inside, like someone standing just on the other side. The knob didn't turn, the door didn't open, he didn't say goodbye. When I drove away, I didn't feel relief. The way I expected, I felt hollow, like I'd left something unfinished. In that hallway, years later, I still wake up sometimes. At 12:17 a.m., without knowing why. My body does it before my mind does, as if some part of me is still listening. For that tapping, through a wall that isn't there anymore. I've never told anyone the full story, because saying it out loud would mean admitting how many chances I had to speak up before it became irreversible. And even now, when I pass old apartment buildings with narrow hallways and identical doors, I catch myself wondering what routines are happening quietly on the other side of someone else's wall.